Your blood sugar is not the problem. This is, and most doctors never tell you. Pause for just a second. I want you to think about something simple. Think about what you ate yesterday. Maybe it was something you would consider healthy. Maybe it was not. Either way, here is what most people do not know. Your blood sugar this morning could look completely normal. Your doctor could look at your results and say everything is fine. And yet, your insulin could have been quietly climbing for the past 10, maybe 15 years. No alarm, no red flag on the lab report, no dramatic warning sign, just subtle things. A little more fatigue after you eat, some extra weight that settled around your middle and never really left, energy that used to stay steady but now crashes by 2 or 3 in the afternoon, cravings that come back fast even when you just ate. These are not random, these are signals, and almost no one explains what they are actually pointing to. Here is the truth that changes everything. By the time your blood sugar is officially high, by the time your doctor is using the word prediabetes or diabetes, the real problem has already been building for years, sometimes a decade or more. The glucose rising on your lab work is not the beginning of the problem. It is a late sign that a process started a long time ago. Most people are watching the smoke. They are not looking at the fire. My name is Dr. Megan Foster. I have been working in clinical medicine for over 24 years, primarily with metabolic and surgical patients. I have sat across from thousands of people who were doing everything they were told and still getting worse. And what I found, time and time again, is that the advice most people receive focuses almost entirely on the wrong target. Today, I am going to explain what that real target is, why it matters more than blood sugar, and 5 practical ways you can start shifting it. Because once you understand the actual mechanism, a lot of things that felt confusing will suddenly make sense, and the path forward becomes much clearer. Let me start with a question. Think back, maybe 15 years ago, maybe 20. You could eat a meal with pasta, maybe some bread, maybe even dessert, and feel relatively fine afterward. Not great necessarily, but fine. You could get up the next morning and feel like yourself. Now think about now. You eat something similar, and within an hour you feel heavy, foggy, maybe a little irritable. Your energy drops and your body wants to lie down. You might feel hungry again 2 hours later, even though you just ate a full meal. Same foods, very different response. And most people assume that is just aging. They assume the body just breaks down over time, and this is what getting older feels like. That is not accurate. And this distinction matters more than almost anything else I can tell you today. What changed is not just the passage of time. What changed is a gradual shift in how your body responds to insulin. And that shift was not inevitable. It was built slowly by a pattern of repeated signals. And because it was built, it can also be addressed. Let me explain the mechanism in plain language, because once you understand this, everything else makes more sense. Your cells need fuel. The main fuel source is glucose, which comes from the food you eat, particularly from carbohydrates and sugars. But glucose cannot just walk into your cells on its own. It needs a key. That key is insulin. Insulin is a hormone made by your pancreas. Every time you eat something that raises your blood sugar, your pancreas releases insulin. The insulin travels through your bloodstream and essentially unlocks the doors of your cells so glucose can enter and be used as energy. When everything is working well, this system is smooth and efficient. A small amount of insulin does the job. Glucose moves into cells, blood sugar comes back down, energy is stable. But here is what happens over time with repeated large carbohydrate meals, constant snacking, frequent blood sugar spikes and crashes. The cells start to become less responsive to insulin. The lock gets sticky. Insulin shows up, tries to open the door, and the door does not open as easily as it used to. So the body does what any logical system does. It makes more insulin, more keys to force the door open. The pancreas works harder, produces more, and for a while it compensates. Blood sugar stays in a normal range. Everything looks fine on paper. But underneath, the system is under strain. The cells are resisting. Insulin levels are elevated. And every large glucose spike puts more friction on a mechanism that is already working overtime. This is called insulin resistance. And it is the underlying driver that most mainstream advice never fully addresses. Now, here is why blood sugar looks normal for so long. Insulin is doing its job. It is compensating. It is forcing the glucose out of the bloodstream and into cells. So your fasting glucose looks okay. Your doctor says your numbers are fine. Meanwhile, insulin is elevated, the cells are resisting, and the process continues to quietly progress. Data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention shows that approximately 88% of adults have some degree of metabolic dysfunction. Most of them have no idea because their blood sugar has not crossed the official threshold yet. Research from long-term studies, including the Framingham Heart Study, showed that elevated fasting insulin appears years, sometimes a decade or more, before blood sugar rises into diabetic range. Years. That is how long this process moves invisibly before it shows up on standard lab work. So when someone finally gets a diagnosis, they often feel blindsided. But the biology has been building since before anyone was looking. Now, here is what I need you to hear. This is not a reason to feel hopeless. This is actually very important context because if the process started years before the diagnosis, that means it can also be interrupted years before things get worse. It means the window for meaningful change is longer than most people think. What took 10 or 15 years to develop can often show measurable improvement in a matter of months, not because of a drug or a supplement or a shortcut, but because the body is responsive. When you change the signals, the body changes its response, but it only works if you target the right mechanism, and that mechanism is insulin. Here is something that takes a lot of people by surprise. Insulin does not just regulate blood sugar. It is one of the most powerful metabolic hormones in the body. When insulin is chronically elevated, it affects fat storage, particularly around the abdomen. It affects inflammation. It affects how the liver processes nutrients. It affects hunger signals and energy regulation. It affects how your brain functions after meals. So many of the symptoms people attribute to aging or stress or just how they are built, the afternoon crash, the constant cravings, the inability to lose weight even when eating less, the brain fog after lunch, these are frequently downstream effects of chronically elevated insulin. When you lower insulin, many of these symptoms improve, not because you found a magic solution, but because you removed the upstream interference. Now, before I walk you through the 5 most powerful ways to do this, I want to share something that surprises most people about what happens inside the body after a high carbohydrate meal. Within minutes of eating something high in rapidly digested starch or sugar, blood glucose begins to rise sharply. The pancreas detects this and releases insulin quickly and in significant amounts. For a period of time, a large amount of insulin is circulating in the bloodstream. Now, here is what that does beyond just moving glucose into cells. Insulin also signals the body to stop burning stored fat. It essentially tells your fat cells to hold on to what they have because there is already fuel available. So as long as insulin is elevated, fat burning is paused. If you are eating frequently throughout the day, and especially if each meal or snack contains a significant amount of carbohydrates, insulin may stay elevated for much of the day. And during those hours, the body has very limited ability to access stored fat for energy. This is not about willpower. This is hormonal signaling. And it is one of the reasons why many people find that reducing meal frequency, even without reducing total calories significantly, can produce changes in body composition that calorie reduction alone did not achieve. Understanding this changes the way you think about food timing and meal structure. It is not just about what you eat. It is also about when and how often you eat. Now, I want to explain something about fructose specifically, because this is a piece that is often missing from popular health advice. Table sugar, the kind in your coffee, your desserts, packaged snacks, it is made of 2 components. One is glucose, the other is fructose. Fructose is also naturally present in fruit and in high concentrations in fruit juice, honey, agave syrup, and many so called natural sweeteners. Here is the key difference: glucose can be processed by essentially every cell in the body. Fructose, however, is processed almost exclusively in the liver, and the liver can only handle so much at once. When fructose arrives at the liver in amounts that exceed its capacity, it converts the excess into fat. Specifically, it contributes to the accumulation of fat within the liver tissue itself. This is called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and it is now one of the most common liver conditions in adults worldwide. Liver fat is not just a storage issue. Excess fat in the liver directly worsens insulin resistance. It interferes with the liver's ability to respond to insulin properly, and it disrupts glucose regulation in ways that affect the entire body. This is why liquid sugar is particularly problematic. When you drink a glass of juice, even natural fruit juice, the fructose arrives at the liver very quickly in a concentrated form. There is no fiber to slow it down, no chewing time, no gradual digestion. The liver gets hit with a large dose all at once. Clinical research has shown that removing sugar-sweetened beverages, including juice, from the diet produces measurable improvements in fasting insulin, liver fat, and metabolic markers within weeks, not months, weeks. Most people think juice is a health food. It is not. It is concentrated sugar without the fiber that made the whole fruit manageable for your metabolism. And this applies to sweetened coffee drinks, energy drinks, flavored waters with added sugar, sweetened teas, and the natural syrups that are marketed as healthier alternatives. Agave syrup, for example, is often presented as a health food, but it is actually higher in fructose than table sugar. So swapping one for the other provides no benefit and may be making things worse. The first practical step is this: remove liquid sugar entirely. Water, plain sparkling water, unsweetened coffee, or tea, these are your defaults. Just this one change alone has a measurable and often rapid effect on insulin dynamics. Now, let me talk about starch, because this is an area where a lot of well meaning health advice is simply inaccurate. You have probably heard that complex carbohydrates are slow and therefore fine, that they are better than simple sugars, that whole grain bread is healthy because it is complex. This is a significant oversimplification that causes a lot of confusion. Here is what starch actually is. Starch is glucose. Long chains of glucose molecules bonded together. Digestion begins almost immediately in your mouth with an enzyme called amylase. As starch breaks down, it releases glucose, and that glucose enters the bloodstream. The rate at which this happens varies. Some starches break down faster than others, but the important point is that many foods considered healthy and complex have a much faster effect on blood glucose than people expect. White bread, for example, has a glycemic index comparable to or higher than table sugar. Regular white rice spikes blood glucose rapidly. Processed cereals, even those marketed as healthy, often contain refined starch that digests almost immediately. And here is what surprises people: many gluten-free alternatives are actually worse. They often use highly refined rice flour, tapioca starch, or potato starch, which digest even faster than the wheat products they replace. Reducing dietary starch, particularly refined and processed starch, is one of the most direct ways to reduce the insulin demand placed on your body throughout the day. Not eliminating carbohydrates entirely for most people, but becoming specific about which ones, how much, and how often. Bread, pasta, white rice, and potatoes are the main contributors for most people in a standard diet. Reducing or replacing these with lower glycemic options makes a significant cumulative difference over time. What should you replace them with? This is where non-starchy vegetables come in, and they deserve their own discussion because they are genuinely powerful in a way that is often underappreciated. Vegetables like leafy greens, broccoli, cauliflower, zucchini, asparagus, green beans, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and similar options have two things going for them metabolically. First, they contain very little starch or sugar relative to their volume. Eating a large portion of these vegetables produces a minimal glucose response. Second, they contain fiber, and fiber plays a critical role in slowing the absorption of glucose from other foods eaten in the same meal. Fiber essentially acts as a buffer, blunting the speed at which glucose enters the bloodstream and reducing the insulin spike that follows. Research consistently shows that high fiber diets improve insulin sensitivity and that this effect occurs independently of weight loss, meaning even before body weight changes significantly, the cells become more responsive to insulin when fiber intake increases. There is also something else happening with high fiber plant foods that connects to gut health. The bacteria in your digestive system ferment certain types of fiber and produce compounds called short chain fatty acids. These compounds have direct effects on metabolic function, including improved insulin sensitivity and reduced inflammatory signaling. So, vegetables are not just a low calorie food to fill your plate. They are an active part of improving how your metabolism works. The practical application is straightforward. Aim to fill at least half your plate at each meal with non-starchy vegetables. Not as an afterthought, not as a small side dish, but as the foundation of the meal. This single structural shift changes the metabolic profile of every meal you eat. The mistake people make here is adding sauces, glazes, or dressings that contain significant sugar, teriyaki sauce, sweet and sour sauce, honey-glazed preparations, and many store-bought dressings can add enough sugar to partially offset the benefit of the vegetables themselves. Keep it simple. Olive oil, lemon, vinegar, herbs, salt. These add flavor without undoing the metabolic benefit. Now, I want to talk about something that has a profound effect on insulin resistance, but is almost never discussed in mainstream nutrition advice, and that is eating frequency. Think about what happens every time you eat. Blood glucose rises, insulin is released. The rise and fall of insulin happens after every single meal and snack. If you are eating 3 meals a day plus 2 snacks, insulin spikes are happening 5 or more times throughout the day. If any of those meals or snacks contain significant carbohydrates, the spikes are larger and more prolonged. Between meals, when you are not eating, insulin levels drop, and during these lower insulin periods, the cells have a chance to recover some of their sensitivity. The body also has the opportunity to shift toward using stored fat for energy. The longer these low insulin windows are, the more time the body has to recalibrate. Reducing the number of times you eat per day is one of the most effective ways to lower average daily insulin levels, even without dramatically changing what you eat. Fewer insulin spikes means lower cumulative insulin exposure. Over time, this allows insulin sensitivity to gradually recover. Time-restricted eating is the term for limiting food intake to a defined window each day. Research on time-restricted eating has shown measurable improvements in fasting insulin, blood glucose regulation, and body composition in people with metabolic dysfunction, sometimes within just a few weeks. The window does not need to be extreme to be effective. Starting with a 12-hour eating window, meaning you eat your first meal and your last meal within a 12-hour span, is a reasonable and manageable starting point. This naturally extends the overnight fasting period, which is already the body's longest daily low insulin window, and allows it to do more metabolic recovery work. Over time, some people find that narrowing to a 10 or 8-hour window produces additional benefits. But the important thing is starting with something sustainable. An eating pattern you can maintain consistently for months will always outperform an aggressive approach you abandon after 2 weeks. The most common mistake here is jumping immediately into a very narrow eating window or extended fasting without a transition period. This often leads to excessive hunger, poor food choices when the eating window opens, and giving up entirely. Gradual adjustment is far more effective and far more likely to stick. Now we come to number 1, and I want to explain why this is number 1. Not because it requires the most effort, but because the effect it produces is almost immediate. It requires no equipment, no preparation, and it works through a mechanism that most people have never heard of. The intervention is simple simple. After your largest meal of the day, take a 10 to 15-minute walk. I know that sounds almost too simple, but let me explain the biology because it changes how you think about this. When your muscles contract during movement, they have the ability to absorb glucose from the bloodstream directly without requiring insulin to do it. They use a separate pathway, a side door into the cell that bypasses the insulin resistance problem entirely. This pathway is activated by muscle contraction, not by insulin. So when you walk after eating, your contracting leg muscles begin pulling glucose out of the bloodstream at the exact moment that glucose is peaking from your meal. The post-meal glucose spike, which is one of the most damaging recurring events in metabolic dysfunction, is significantly blunted. Multiple studies have confirmed this. A 10-minute walk after a meal reduces the post-meal glucose peak more effectively than a 30-minute walk at a different time of day. The timing matters because of when blood glucose is rising. And the downstream effect is significant. A lower post-meal glucose spike means a smaller insulin response. A smaller insulin response means less strain on the cells, less insulin resistance reinforcement, and more time in a lower insulin state. Most people notice the effects within a few days. The afternoon energy crash becomes less severe. The heaviness and fog that often follow lunch diminishes. Hunger comes back more predictably rather than crashing in 2 hours. These are not placebo effects. They are the direct result of lower post-meal glucose and insulin levels. This is why walking after meals is number one on this list. Not because it burns significant calories. It does not. But because it intervenes at exactly the right moment in the metabolic process, and it does so through a mechanism that works even in people with significant insulin resistance. You do not need a gym. You do not need special equipment. You do not need to be fit. A slow walk around the block works. A walk around your office works. If you cannot go outside, walking in place for 10 minutes works. The threshold for benefit is very low. The barrier to entry is almost nothing. And yet most people who are managing blood sugar issues have never been told this. Now I want to pause here and acknowledge something important. If you are currently managing diabetes with medication, or if you have been prescribed any medication related to blood sugar or insulin, please do not make sudden or drastic changes to your diet or activity without talking to your doctor first. The strategies in this video are generally safe and well supported by research, but when combined with certain medications, changes in diet and activity can affect medication dosing needs. Work with your provider as you make adjustments. For everyone else, the principle of gradual change still applies. Do not try to do everything at once. The body adapts better when changes are introduced progressively. Attempting a complete overhaul of diet and lifestyle simultaneously often leads to burnout and reversal. A reasonable progression looks like this. Start by removing liquid sugar. Just that. Give it 2 weeks. Pay attention to how you feel. Many people notice improvements in energy and hunger patterns within 10 to 14 days from this change alone. Then add the post-meal walk, even just on most days, even if it is only 10 minutes. Add that practice alongside the liquid sugar removal and observe the cumulative effect. Then begin adjusting starch intake. Reduce bread, white rice, and processed starches. Replace volume with non-starchy vegetables. This does not need to happen overnight. Shifting one meal at a time is a legitimate approach. Finally, begin adjusting eating frequency. If you are currently eating 5 or 6 times a day, bring it to 3. Establish a 12-hour eating window. Give your body extended low insulin periods each day. This progression is not the fastest path, but it is the most sustainable one. And sustainability is what produces long-term improvement. Now, I want to talk about what happens inside the body during a low insulin period, because understanding this gives you a completely different relationship with the time between meals. When insulin is low, several important things happen simultaneously. The body shifts its primary fuel source away from glucose and towards stored fat. Fat cells begin releasing fatty acids into the bloodstream to be used for energy. The liver begins a process of internal cleanup called autophagy, where cells break down and recycle damaged components. Inflammatory signaling decreases. Growth hormone, which supports muscle preservation and tissue repair, rises. These are regenerative processes. They are the body's maintenance mode, and they can only happen in a state of low insulin. Constant eating keeps insulin elevated almost continuously, which means these processes rarely get the time they need. The body is perpetually in fuel intake mode and never gets to enter maintenance mode. This is one of the reasons why the timing and frequency of eating matters so much beyond just the calories consumed. Two people eating the same number of calories can have very different metabolic outcomes depending on how those calories are distributed across the day and how long the low insulin periods are between meals. There is also something important happening with sleep in this context. The overnight period, assuming you are not eating late at night, represents the longest natural low insulin window of the day. During deep sleep, blood glucose regulation is active, growth hormone is released in significant amounts, and the body performs many of its most important repair processes. Late night eating, particularly anything that spikes blood sugar, interrupts this process. Blood glucose rises, insulin responds, and the repair window is shortened. This is one of the reasons why what you eat in the evening and when you stop eating matters for metabolic health, not just for weight management, but for how well your body functions at a cellular level. A practical guideline is to stop eating 2 to 3 hours before bed. This gives the body time to bring blood sugar back down before sleep begins and allows the overnight low insulin window to extend as long as possible. Now, I want to address something that comes up very frequently in conversations about carbohydrates and blood sugar. The idea that fruit is healthy and therefore fruit sugar is fine. Fruit is not the same as candy, but it is also not metabolically neutral. Fruit contains fructose, and as we discussed earlier, fructose is processed in the liver. Whole fruit also contains fiber, which slows absorption significantly compared to juice. So whole fruit and fruit juice are not metabolically equivalent, even if they come from the same source. In moderate amounts, whole fruit as part of a diet that is otherwise low in refined sugar and starch is generally manageable for most people. The fiber content, the volume of water, and the presence of other nutrients mean that the fructose load from a piece of fruit arrives at the liver slowly and in a smaller dose. But consuming multiple servings of fruit per day, particularly high sugar fruits like mangoes, grapes, pineapple, and bananas, can contribute meaningfully to fructose load. And for someone who is already dealing with insulin resistance or metabolic dysfunction, this can work against the improvements they are trying to make. Lower sugar fruits like berries, green apples, and citrus tend to be better choices in this context, not because fruit is inherently bad, but because total fructose intake matters, and some fruits contribute significantly more than others. Let me now talk about protein, because it plays an important and often underappreciated role in insulin regulation and metabolic recovery. Protein has a much more modest effect on blood glucose than carbohydrates. It does stimulate some insulin release, but far less than an equivalent calorie load of starch or sugar. And it provides a strong satiety signal, meaning it reduces hunger and extends the time before you feel the need to eat again. One of the most practical benefits of increasing protein in the diet is that it naturally displaces carbohydrates. When a meal contains adequate protein, people tend to eat less starch without feeling deprived. The satiety lasts longer, the post-meal glucose spike is lower, and the insulin response is more moderate. Protein also supports muscle mass. And muscle mass matters for metabolic health in a way that is directly relevant to insulin resistance. Muscle tissue is the largest site of glucose uptake in the body. More muscle means more capacity for glucose clearance, both at rest and during movement. This is one of the reasons why maintaining or increasing muscle mass through resistance exercise can have a meaningful effect on insulin sensitivity over time. You do not need to become an athlete for this effect to matter. Even modest resistance training 2 to 3 times per week using body weight exercises or light weights has been shown to improve insulin sensitivity and glucose metabolism in people with metabolic dysfunction. The combination of protein adequacy and some form of resistance activity is one of the most underutilized tools in metabolic recovery, not because the research is unclear, but because it is rarely discussed in the context of blood sugar management. Now, I want to revisit something I mentioned early in this video because I think it is worth expanding on. The idea that this was not inevitable aging. There is a cultural narrative that metabolic decline, weight gain around the middle, fatigue after meals, and rising blood sugar are simply what getting older looks like. That this is the default trajectory. That there is not much to be done beyond medication once the process has started. This narrative is not supported by the research. What the research shows is that these changes are largely driven by accumulated lifestyle patterns, not by the passage of time itself. Yes, certain hormonal shifts with aging affect metabolism. Yes, muscle mass tends to decline with age if not actively maintained. But the dramatic metabolic dysfunction that most people experience is not a biologically required consequence of getting older. It is a consequence of specific patterns repeated over a long period of time. The reason this matters is not to create guilt. The patterns that drive metabolic dysfunction are not personal failures. They are largely the result of a food environment and cultural habits that make these patterns easy and almost default. Cheap, highly processed, starch and sugar-heavy food is everywhere. Eating frequently is the norm. Sedentary habits after meals are universal. Understanding the mechanism does not mean blaming yourself for the outcome. It means recognizing that changing the inputs changes the outputs, regardless of how long the current pattern has been running. People in their 50s, 60s, and 70s who make sustained changes to their eating patterns, movement habits, and meal timing show measurable improvements in insulin sensitivity, body composition, and metabolic markers. The biology of recovery does not stop working with age. It just requires consistent and appropriate inputs. I also want to address sleep briefly, not because it is one of the 5 main strategies, but because its effect on insulin resistance is large enough that ignoring it limits the results of everything else. Poor sleep, particularly insufficient sleep or disrupted sleep, has a direct and measurable negative effect on insulin sensitivity. A single night of poor sleep can produce a temporary worsening of insulin resistance equivalent to several months of metabolic decline under normal conditions. This recovers with adequate sleep, but if poor sleep is chronic, the cumulative effect is significant. During sleep, the body regulates cortisol, a stress hormone that raises blood glucose and counteracts insulin. When sleep is poor, cortisol stays elevated longer. Hunger hormones shift in ways that increase appetite, particularly for high carbohydrate foods. And the regenerative low insulin processes I described earlier are shortened. So, if you are implementing dietary changes, adding post-meal walks, and reducing eating frequency, but your sleep is consistently poor, you are working against a significant metabolic headwind. Addressing sleep quality is not optional if the goal is meaningful improvement in insulin resistance. The basics matter here. A consistent sleep and wake time, even on weekends. A dark and cool bedroom environment, not eating within 2 to 3 hours of bedtime, limiting bright screen exposure in the hour before sleep. These are not novel ideas, but their metabolic relevance is more significant than most people realize. Now, let me bring this all together and answer the question that is really at the center of everything I have shared today. Why do people follow all the standard advice, eat less, move more, avoid fat, count calories, and still find that things do not improve the way they expected? Because the standard advice does not target insulin resistance directly. It targets downstream symptoms, it reduces calories without addressing the hormonal environment, it adds exercise without optimizing meal timing, it replaces one processed food with another labeled as healthy without addressing the insulin demand the new food creates. When you understand that the root driver is chronically elevated insulin and that insulin is elevated because of frequent eating, high starch intake, liquid sugar consumption, and insufficient low insulin recovery windows, you can design a different strategy, one that works with the biology instead of around it. The goal is not a perfect diet. The goal is a lower average daily insulin level sustained over months. And the way you get there is through consistent application of a few well targeted behaviors, not through perfection on any single day. Blood sugar follows insulin. Fix the insulin environment, and blood sugar regulation improves as a result. This is not a hypothesis. This is the documented mechanism underlying type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and a large portion of the chronic health conditions affecting most adults in developed countries today. You do not fix a downstream symptom by chasing the symptom. You fix it by addressing the source. Same food options, same body, different strategy. Here is your 30-day starting framework. For the first week, remove all liquid sugar. No juice, no soda, no sweetened coffee drinks, no energy drinks. Just this. Pay attention to your energy levels and hunger patterns by the end of the week. In the second week, add a 10 to 15-minute walk after your largest meal of the day, every day if possible, most days as a minimum. Combine this with the liquid sugar removal from week 1. In the third week, begin reducing your starch intake. Remove or significantly reduce bread and processed grain products first. Replace that volume on your plate with non-starchy vegetables. You do not need to track anything. Just shift the plate proportions. In the fourth week, address your eating window. Establish a 12-hour window. Stop eating 2 to 3 hours before bed. Let the overnight low insulin period extend. At the end of 30 days, observe what has changed: morning energy, post-meal fatigue, waist measurement, hunger predictability, sleep quality. These are the markers that reflect what is actually happening in your metabolism, and they often shift before any formal lab work reflects the improvement.